Hey, thanks for coming. Can everybody hear me? If you can hear me, put something in the chat. This actually looks like, assuming everybody can hear me, this should be pretty straightforward and has been pretty easy to set up. Awesome. I'm going to do this real quick. I've got a little mic. We'll see if this sounds better. So let me know if what I'm about to do sounds better. All right, do you prefer this or do you prefer what you heard a minute ago? Which one sounds clearer, better, or can you not hear me at all? Both are good. All right, well, I'll just keep this in. Usually this helps cut down on the echo a little bit. Excuse me. All right. Well, hey everybody, let's see. I'm gonna see if I can get one more thing set up. I was trying to get a little monitor off to the side so I could more easily check on comments. But I have to see if I can find the stream on here. If not, I will just have to check from time to time. Yep, it's not showing up on this. All right, well, I will just try and pay attention to what people are saying on the screen every now and then. Is there a way? Here we go. Can I? Okay, well, I am able to go check on the chat over on my other computer, so I'll just do that from time to time if I end up, so I don't miss some comments. But I want to get a little bit of sculpting done while we're here. So, thanks for joining me, everybody that's here already, and for those that are viewing at a future date. Before we get started, I wanted to just share a quick little thing. I wanted to remind everybody they can get my Ultimate Quick Start Guide to Sculpting Miniatures down in the link in the description below. Sign up for the newsletter and I'll send this off to you. Also, if you join, and I separate my mailing list into two groups, people who are interested in sculpting and people who are interested in the miniatures that I make. And sometimes there's a crossover. So if you want to make sure you're on this miniatures list as well as the sculpting list, you can let me know and I'll add you to that. I try and keep them distinct unless every now and then there's an announcement that I send out to everybody when there's something that's for everybody, but I try and keep it separate so that if you're just interested in sculpting, you aren't hearing me advertise about miniatures all the time. All right. Let's see here. Is there, so I'm streaming this from my phone, and apparently it only lets me see the messages for a split second. So I'm going to go back to the chat real quick and see what I see. All right, so Perkins, you got a bunch of goblins and gnomes, awesome. My mic sound good? All right, so no other questions or comments, so I'll just get started here. So I wanted to share a little bit about this figure that I'll be working on today. This is a figure that it has to be at least 10 years ago that I started it. It actually started, I can't remember what came first. I can't remember if I was creating these concept arts for these larger, epically heroic guys, or if I made a miniature. It was probably somewhat in tandem, but I was really getting into this mode of wanting to sculpt figures that weren't just all standardly 28 millimeter. If you had a bigger, more superhero-esque person, I wanted it to be a larger scale. So I ended up making this armature here, and just to give you some context, this is about 35 millimeters tall, to his feet. But by the time I would build up his head and whatnot, and maybe a little bit under his feet, that's how I typically would use my precast armatures, he would end up being about 38 millimeters tall. So I made these precast armatures just to help be consistent, because this was a little bit out of the norm of the scale and size that I was doing. And I only ever used it once to start this putty catcher. I didn't do one on this concept. This is actually going to be a different character, a heavily armored knight with a big mace. Yeah, I basically used him as a putty catcher during all this time. And so yeah, it's time to start doing something with this figure. Hey, Joe. So first thing is I ended up teaching a little sculpting lesson to a local friend of mine named Colton. And while I was teaching him how to do some things, I brought this here to show him some techniques and also just to have something to do while he was working on his. So I started to build up this face. However, I was thinking about maybe doing this all in green stuff, but I am definitely going to do the bulk of this figure in polyclay. So Themo. All right. So first of all, to my point, what I was getting at was I built up this face thinking that I was going to do more clay and whatnot, but I am actually going to use the putty. Sorry, I flip that sometimes. I thought I was going to do it all in putty. I'm going to do it in clay. So this head is probably a little bit too big because it's already 6 millimeters tall, which is about as tall as I like to do a head. And I could leave that, but it's also got a little bit more depth front to back than I would like. I like to have it trimmed back just a little more so that I have more room to build up with the clay and sculpt the figure. All right, so before I start doing that, let's do a question. I don't know if anybody ever watched Mark Crilly's videos back in the day. I don't know if he still does this, but he used to print out comments people would do with questions and read them, and I always thought that was cool, so I thought I would do that too. So this question's from Komodo, and if I recall, the question actually starts here. So my question, though, is, sorry if I covered it somewhere else. All right, when you work in polymer clay, do you work in layers with multiple bakes or sculpt it all at once? If you do work in layers, how do you build up? Do you sculpt the feet and the legs up, or do you sculpt under layers, the basic form, outer layers? Along with that, do you use any kind of liquid clay when attaching or baking new layers or armatures? I've tried a lot of different ways, and they all seem to have benefits and drawbacks, so I'm asking about your experiences. All right, well, there's a lot of intricacies in that question, but the big thing is, no, I don't sculpt in layers if I take your question in the main sense of what it means, meaning when I sculpt with clay, I'm sculpting the whole figure in clay, and I don't bake it until I am done sculpting with clay. So yes, there will be layers. I'll put on an initial layer of clay, and then I'll add up more things as I go, but it's all wet and unbaked. As far as how I work and build things up, inevitably you have to focus on one area, but I try to do as much of the whole figure as possible. So I will, as you'll see a little bit tonight, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to skin this whole figure with a thin layer of green stuff, and then I'm going to start applying some clay to that. The green stuff helps the clay stick to the armature. And normally I wouldn't have this much understructure built up, and if this was a different figure, I would actually clean off a lot of this to make it thinner, but this is going to be a pretty big and bulky figurine, so it's okay that it has this mass. In fact, it'll actually save me some time sculpting. I'll be able to get into the details a little faster. But it's, you end up getting a nice thin layer, and then I just start building up the big forms and just to get the whole shape figured out before I start diving into a lot of details. Hello, Jeff. Thanks for coming. All right, I'm going to cut this face off real quick because I don't want to be squishing everything around. which I will be doing in a minute when I start to get the initial layer of putty going. So I ended up bulking this face up a little too much, despite what I just said. And so I want to get this a little bit knocked down a little bit more to give me a little bit more room to play with the clay as I'm setting up the forms. So trimming that off. Oh shoot, I bent his arm. Now one thing about this figure, I've been actually, with a lot of my figures, I've worked very hard and gotten pretty good about coming up with dynamic poses that can be cast in one piece. This figure is not going to be able to do that. I am absolutely going to have to pull, I probably should, just because of how big he is, chop off both arms. There's a slight chance I could get away with leaving this arm, but it is off the mold plane quite a bit. So you can see if that was the mold plane, and if we turned it like this, it'd be even worse. So you'd have to split the difference to get to the middle, but then you have a leg. So there's always going to be something falling into one half or the other of the mold. All right. I'm going to see some of those questions, if anybody said anything. Any updates on your new game? Yes. So I actually, do I have anything handy that I can show you? I don't have anything at my desk. Everything is out at the at my game table set up. I was taking some pictures last night. So the update for the game is I'll be at Adepticon with it. I have made a fully fledged, fully playable scenario to be able to show off. So the other scenarios that would come in the final game, things like that, are still being developed, but I wanted to have a fully realized playable experience for Adepticon. So what I'll have there is I'll have 4 different goblin groups for people to play in the demo against each other all at the same time, and they will be robbing Farmer Gamut. It's called Super Garden Sweep, and they're going to try and be making off with poor, well, I shouldn't say poor and helpless, because he's pretty mean and nasty, and he's got a dog that's going to help protect things too. And that's just some of the stuff the goblins will have to contend with in this the fun little romp that everybody gets to go on. How do you get green stuff very thin without it sticking to everything? Well, one of the biggest things you can do is I use petroleum jelly or Vaseline, stuff like that, something like that. Where is mine? I've actually gotten pretty good about not needing it too often, but I have misplaced it. My wife was borrowing it or something. Anyways, that's a big thing you can do. You can also, I've talked about this before, using your nose grease. If you just have a little bit of oil, but if you're having trouble with your putty and you want to get it thin and it's sticking to your tools a lot, having a little bit of that petroleum jelly or some sort of little greasiness on your tool is a big help. The other thing is if you have these color shapers or clay shapers, the putty won't stick to it for the most part. You actually, if it is possible, but it's very hard, and it's to do that, and you can usually get it spread on there. Yeah, I usually use that, but I'm not in need of it very often, primarily because a lot of my sculpting is done with polyclay. So you'll see, oh, I actually need more of this stuff. All right, so I'm just going to mix up a little bit of putty to start building up the understructure of the clay for this figure. I'm going to leave these boots. These might end up being a little too big and bulky, but I'll, if I recall, I think I actually broke his ankles at one point, so I think that's why that's built up. And I think I'm going to have enough material so it won't won't be too difficult. Now, I don't know if I probably do have slightly oily skin, so I don't, and I've also learned how to hold. I know a lot of people have trouble with putty getting stuck to their fingers, and but I generally don't. So if you have a less oily skin, it could definitely happen. But if you're not, there's also, I feel like I have developed, there is a touch you can develop that helps it not stick to you as much. All right. So I'm just going to start. I usually start, now this is bulked up. If this was a wire armature, I would definitely start around the core with this. I'll go ahead and emulate that just because. So I just set a little bit of green stuff on. The tricky part about this is it's green on green, so if I'm not careful, it's not the end of the world, but I might miss that I don't have fresh green stuff on certain parts. So most polyclay, you have to have something like this go down first. You can see here, nothing's sticking to my tool, and I'm pressing this pretty thin. You don't need this to be bulky. In fact, you don't want it to be bulky when you're putting down this first layer of green stuff to be under your polyclay. But most polyclay, you do need to have something like this for it to stick to. It won't stick to it. It'll stick to itself as long as it isn't baked, but it definitely won't stick to anything else. Now, bees putty, that's a very cool material, and I've done some videos on that. That you can, if you prepare the armature and use the bees putty correctly, you can actually apply it straight to the wire armature, which is pretty neat, because this, I'm very used to this, and I do like this, and I like using Fimo, but it's pretty nice to be able to skip that step of adding on extra stuff. Was there anything else in Komodo's question? I feel like there was. Working in layers. Yeah, I mean, there's always benefits, and as you sculpt, you're going to find certain things that you prefer. You know, just like I mentioned here, you know, I don't actually mind this stage too much, and it's something you can kind of do a little bit when you get used to it. You can actually do it somewhat mindlessly, you know, when you're watching TV or something else is going on. You're not expending creative energy. All right, what do you mean with prepare the armature? Like thinning the putty with mineral spirits? Yes, that is what I'm talking about. Another thing you can do is you can score your armature. I just rolled over my audio cord. Does room temp affect how malleable green stuff is? I'll get to that in a second. Yeah, so if you do a little scoring on your armature, that can help everything stick. But yes, when you're working with bees putty, you basically can create a little clay slurry, paint that on, that creates a texture. You have to let it set up. So, you know, you can't just, usually aren't gonna immediately dive right into it. So there still is some wait time, but it's a lot easier than spreading the right thickness of green stuff on everything like I'm doing right now, especially when it's directly to a wire. Yes, room, hey Sam. So yes, room temperature plays a big thing with green stuff, and frankly all the clays as well. If it's cold, everything's tougher and stiffer. For green stuff, that means it's also it can be less sticky, which some people, you know, might prefer, because I know that's a big challenge. But when it comes, but I tend to want it to be sticky. You know, I want it to adhere, and I want it to be malleable so I can make it thin very easily. So if it's warmer though, if it's too warm, everything can be super soft and squishy, and if you're not used to that, it can be a little hard to manage everything. All right, I'm going to do, and then, you know, with your polyclay, you always need to knead it a little bit to get it conditioned and ready to apply. All right, let's do this question while I get this ready. All right, this is from Market Research Reading. Yeah, he was talking about Ed. I was very sad to hear about his passing. All right, where's the question here? Oh, Ed recommended the channel. Here we go. How to pace myself. Do I keep trying to force putty to stay on an armature or wait for it to cure? Okay, so market research had a lot of questions and comments about wanting to get to be able to sculpt a full figure. And the reason why I wanted to highlight this one was this last part. How to pace myself. Do I keep trying to force putty to stay on an armature or wait for it to cure? And I thought that really resonated with me because I have always been someone that, oh, I just found my Vaseline. I forgot it's on this. I'm getting a little distracted here, but anyways, what I was going to say is this is something that I've always struggled with. I don't want to say struggle with, but it's something that the way I've always worked is I will start my sculpt and I just sculpt it into submission. If something isn't working, I don't throw it away, I don't trash it, I just keep at it until it's done. And I don't know if that's a good idea. I know when I went to art school, most of my professors taught and suggested that you need to let go of things and be willing to throw it away. Don't let it be precious. And as I've gotten older and wiser with this, I think they're totally right. But I've always had this habit or feeling that I can't, once I've invested, I just got to keep going, got to see it through. If I just keep working it, it will get there. Which is why, I think one reason why I'm not as big a fan of sculpting completely out of putty, because there's a lot more pressure with that. You do have a time crunch, and it's always just been more of a challenging medium to me to sculpt with. The clay is a lot more forgiving. Yes, you're a huge fan of the sunk cost fallacy, yes. Are you a huge fan, meaning you're going to keep pounding at it, or that you're willing to throw it away? I sometimes wish I'm willing to throw it away. I actually was thinking about this when I got this question. I do have several, not too many, but I do have several sculpts. You're never willing to throw it away. Okay, that's what I thought you meant. Yeah. Greetings, Zesterfield. Yeah, I am, it's very, very hard. Now, one thing that I have noticed, especially as I've been going through some of my old art, like I showed that sketch earlier, is I think that it's good. It's not bad necessarily to walk, and it might be better to just walk away, start something new. But I actually don't believe in the idea of actually throwing away and completely losing it, because I think they're usually, while it might not be working at the time, or it might not be what you want or need at that moment, I think most of the time we're creating things that have some value. You can look back and see where you grew. And in many cases, I've actually had found some old concepts that I was just not happy with or wasn't feeling, and then it just inspires me. Now, maybe my ability has caught up with what I was trying to do, or vice versa, and it's a lot easier sometimes to go back and see something you created that you can now expand on, rather than having to make something fresh and new every single time. What time I can watch your live stream? Long time follower. Yes, first time. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I used to do these a lot, and I would have people come on and join me. I would like to do that again. I'd have to look into that, how that would work. I think it should work. It used to be very easy when, will this fig be in plate or chain? Both. Mostly plate. There will be some chain. He will have a chain coif. But yeah, Google, when they kind of separated Hangouts from YouTube and all this stuff, I couldn't figure out an easy way to get this to work, so I just put it to the wayside. But now it seems like everything is pretty easy to get set up nowadays. And I've learned a little more about streaming. Yes, Discord. Yep. Yeah, that's great. That's a good point. I only get rid of something if I've remade and improved it. Oh man, I wish it would. Oh wait. Oh darn it! I did find a way to get the comment to stay up, but I have to touch it in time. What'd you say, B? All right. You only get rid of something if you remade and improved it, but it holds some special meaning. I keep it. I still have my War of the Worlds Planets Plasticine ship. Wow, from 30 years ago. That's awesome. Yeah, but I would love to share some of the sculpts that I started and didn't finish, which, like I said, there isn't many, because most of the time, and maybe this is good, most of the time when I've not finished something, it was pretty early on. I just wasn't feeling the concept, or I decided to sculpt something completely different. So that's how that ended up working for me. Anthony says, I wish I have time to sculpt. Having a full-time job and daughter really makes it tough. Content really helped remind me of how to stay in the game. Awesome. Yes. Thank you. It's hard there's so many things to engage our attention, and yeah, it's been a struggle for me over the years. I've had to be very deliberate. I very rarely play video games. That's a newer thing for me in the last several years, but that helps. There was a big turning point for me with a lot of this stuff, though, was when I always knew it in my heart, but what I had to do for myself to start making more progress was I had to finally realize that the fun thing that I was doing was creating for myself, rather than finding something else to fill the time. It takes a little longer. It's hard to get over the hump because, I'm not going to sculpt this in a couple minutes. But all right, I'm going to do another question here from Xenoserum. Who was the mold maker and what were they using to do a mold with Plasticard? All right, my mold maker, pretty much the only mold maker I think they are the only mold maker I've used personally, if I think about it. Yeah, my stuff's been molded and casted by a lot of people, but the people that I use is Fortress Figures, Jeff and Ben Rodman. They are in Jonesboro, Indiana. They're an awesome shop. Great guys. I have known them since sometime back in my college days. I can't remember what year it would have been. It probably was my junior year, maybe senior year. And I encountered them I can't remember if I first encountered them on the One List Sculpting or if I was just searching for internships with game companies specifically. And I did a MathQuest search and I couldn't believe it, but there was a game related thing, not just a game related thing, a miniatures related thing, like 5 minutes from where I was going to college. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. It definitely would have been my senior year because when I met them, I recall I had my second sculpt in hand, a little dwarf figure. And I rolled up in there. I was so excited and I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to work for them. I'm going to, get a job in the game industry because, nobody else is sculpting miniatures around here. They'll need somebody. And, and then they were like, yeah, but they're just a small shop too, even though they do so much awesome, great stuff. So they didn't need my help or anything, but they were super generous, and it was a big leap for me in my learning and understanding because I had some concept of what it was to mold the figures. I had a mentor share some of that with me, but there was a lot more to grasp than I realized. All right, Zesterfield. I can see a casted armature top right. Better casted ones or wire handmade ones? I prefer, so this I have showed this earlier. This is the precast armature that I used to make this guy. I prefer the wire ones just because you get a little more control, but the thing that are really cool about these are, especially if you're doing multiple figures, is you're dead on with your proportions and sizing every time. So it can be a really good way to speed things up or to maintain consistency. Now, if you build armatures enough, you'll be able to build them consistently every single time as well, but that takes time. It takes more time. So put a little bit more, get a little more putty on this thing. No problem. All right, let's see if I can do another question. I would love to get through all of these and answer everything that you guys have. All right, Ryan O'Brien. Hey, Tom, this is brilliant. Let's see. Quick question. Are you doing the illustrations featured here as well? I hear you using the name Procreate and know that that name could refer to both Sculpting Putty and digital art app. Top-notch stuff. I both in both skill and presentation. Well, thank you. So if you hear me talk about Procreate on the channel, I'm usually referring to the putty. That's especially if you're listening to things like my the sculpting archives. I don't really use Procreate anymore, and that is really only because I just had trouble finding it. It's been a challenge to find that. And again, I sculpt most of my figures with polyclay, and for that I use a little bit of green stuff to get it going. Everything in polyclay, Fimo Professional to be exact. And then I might do additional details at the end, in which case I do use green stuff for that. I don't mind. I actually really like sculpting smaller little details with green stuff because it can be a little bit softer and you can really get it thin. However, with that said, I do a lot of my own concepts. Well, actually, I should say, for the stuff that's for my own lines, I have pretty much done all the concepts. A lot of those are actually done just in my sketchbook. In fact, a lot of times it's in my sketch wallet. If anybody likes to draw and wants to make sure they always have a sketchbook with them, and you don't mind that it's small because you just want to make sure you have something, I highly recommend the sketch wallet. It comes in a bunch of different sizes, and it's basically a really nicely made wallet that fits a sketchbook in it. Goes from the small field note size down to these more micro ones. But I do some other illustration and other programs such as the digital Procreate. But that's relatively new to me. I'll share something here in a second. What is Sam saying? It's late here and I have to go to bed. But I'd like to know how you sit when modeling. Do you bend your back? I'll watch tomorrow. Good night. All right, Sam. Yeah. So right now I am sitting in my desk chair. I am not hunched over. I am pretty straight backed, but I am looking down at my table. Maybe I'll see if I can send a picture sometime, but the way I normally sit though, is I have a high back chair and I lean back in it and I just rest back. My head tilts forward a little bit, but not, heavily arched or anything. And I just cradle this near my face and with the light right above me, so I got plenty of light, and it's very comfortable. I can sculpt for hours that way and with no strain or anything like that. When I'm doing something like this, obviously I'll try to be a little more cognizant of where I am and how I'm sitting, because you can get strained very easily. And when I'm recording sculpting, and I might fall into that trap here too if I were to be getting into more details, I do tend to be a little bit more bent down because I need to get my face a little closer to where my camera is. And I have I wear an Optivisor now so I can see the details easier. So I have to get a little bit closer than I maybe used to. Mega posture for mega results. That's right. I've got to find a way to get a little demo screen or a little other screen over here so I don't have to keep rolling away. But think this is working out all right for now. All right, let's see, another question. Oh, yeah, I'll do this real quick. Johnny Rotten, what do you mean by kneaded-tight and green stuff mix? I always thought they were the same thing. So Johnny is talking about one of the videos I posted recently. I can't remember if it was a sculpting archive or something else, but I mistakenly, yeah, it was a sculpting archive. I mistakenly said that a figure, that I was sculpting a figure using a kneaded-tight and green stuff mix, and that is correct. Those are the same thing, so that's a silly thing to say. What I meant to say was a kneaded-tight and Procreate mix or kneaded-tight and Fimo mix. I think I was actually meant to say Fimo. There was a very brief time where a bunch of the sculptors, myself included, at Reaper, were experimenting with mixing putty with polyclay. And it was pretty cool because it made the putty act a lot more like clay. It delayed how long it took to cure, but it would actually cure. And then you could throw it in your putty oven just to get some extra heat on it, and that would help actually bake the clay a little bit. But it was interesting because obviously the clay was not fully baked. It was only hardening because of the putty curing, but for whatever reason, that made it fairly strong and durable. Let's adjust my camera a little bit because I feel like I'm falling off. There, that's a little better. I feel like I was having to, speaking of posture, I was having to stretch I'm on the edge of my desk right off screen, and I was having to stretch really far in order to get it on the screen there. Oh, I'll show you this real quick. So back to that question about illustrations. So I've had Procreate for quite some time, but I have had a big challenge with drawing digitally. There's something about it. I haven't been able to get past this idea of using, I don't know, I draw a lot with a pencil, and it just feels weird that you can be drawing with a quote-unquote pencil and then just make it whatever size you want at any moment. I'm used to working with very distinct lines. If I want a thicker line, I get a thicker tool, and it just felt weird. So, but here's a couple things I drew. This is little Goblin Menace face. Actually, this is a version where I tried it with pupils. I don't like them with pupils. I like it. I don't mind when other people paint them. I think they do a good job, but I, for whatever reason, like these guys to have whites of their eyes, just like Jim Lee's X-Men back in the day. There we go. So I did that in here, and then this is a concept I did. This started out as, oh, I'm gonna mess myself up. Well, okay. This started out as just a pencil sketch in my sketch wallet that I just took a picture of, threw it in there, and then I inked over it, added some ink wash effects, and then there we go. And then lastly, I drew a little puppy dog for the farmer. In the game, I don't know if I'll keep this a corgi. Originally, I was using a Great Dane, the awesome Great Dane figure from Hassle-Free Miniatures. His not Scooby-Doo. But a good friend of mine, Ben, loaned me a dog figure. He didn't loan me, he gave it to me. He gave me a dog figure that he painted to use. And so yeah, I wanted to use that one instead, because I wasn't sure about using the Great Dane. I was trying to make every single thing you would see in the demo be something that I made or I sculpted. And that should be the case for everything except for the dog. Just couldn't quite swing that in time. All right, put this last bit on, and then we'll start adding more clay. So you can just, if you're layering up your figure and getting it ready like this, you can, usually I'll put quite a lot of putty, as much as I can, and then I'll just get back to the clay. But this figure's a little bit larger, and obviously I'm talking, but it's totally fine to do a little bit at a time, just like this, you know. That's what's cool about putty and green stuff specifically, is it's very sticky, so you're always going to be able to add more on. as needed. All right, I'll do another question. And I'll pop over the chat again, see if I've missed anything. This is from Manakria. Have you ever done a video on how to make a range of miniatures look cohesive, or what makes them easy or difficult to paint? I have not done a video on either of those subjects, but that is a great idea. I will say I can speak a little bit to what makes a figure easy to paint or not, as I have started to paint a lot of my own miniatures. And one of the things that I really like this lighter, simpler style. It's how I like to draw. I really like grew up liking cartoons, and I like how they find a way to do this really, really cool designs, but without them being overworked with detail. I mean, sculptors who do all that detail and everything are amazing, and I love it, but I don't enjoy putting in gratuitous detail. And more importantly, and what really drove me to start doing this in my own work, was I don't enjoy painting figures with a lot of detail. I am much more, I like to paint things and make them look good, so that can take a bit of time, but I'm not trying to be a Golden Demon miniature painter or anything like that. And while details can help with that, because it makes for more fun things to highlight and show off your skill with, it's not conducive to me. I want really cool looking game figures. I'm not looking to make art pieces. So I work very hard to strike a balance of detail and concept, I guess I would say. You want to have the right simplicity. You want to have the right amount of elements so the figure doesn't look bare and boring. But if you want to make it easier, it's good to find ways to simplify on those details. Focus on doing the key things that really matter to the figure and character, and they'll stand out. Planet Tobor, is it 50-50 for Fimo and conditioner? You can go 50-50 for Fimo and conditioner. So with Fimo, you can sculpt with it straight, just by itself, but Fimo also makes a thing called a conditioner that just helps revitalize the clay, makes it a little smoother. I only put about 10% when I do my first initial mix of clay. I'll put in about 10% of that. But sometimes if the clay's fresh enough, I don't even worry about it at all. But if you've got some clay that's a little older, then yeah, you might want to do more than that. All right. All right, I'm just gonna peek at the chat real quick. Oops. All right, sweet. I'm actually keeping up on it, so that's good. All right, let's do another question. From Daniel Smith. I've noticed in some videos you use a little plier clip thing to hold small pieces, like in my pistol video. What is that tool? Daniel, actually, I told him that I'd answer on the video, and he said, okay, he'll wait, but he's pretty sure they're forceps. And he's right, they're forceps. And that might not be the technical name, but I think it is. I can't remember if forceps actually have an extra bend. I'm trying to find where mine are. Can't remember. But yeah, basically, it's a medical clamp. So, it's got a very tiny tweezer with little teeth in it at the end. It'll pinch and lock. It's just a very useful tool. A lot of times, sometimes if I need to get in on a figure, not usually when it's polyclay, because I don't want these to be off the base and being handled, but if you really need to get in and under somewhere, you can pop them off, clamp them on there, do your work, throw them back on. All right, Perkins, do you recommend starting with a larger fig, like a giant, for 20mm? Well, that somewhat depends on what you're interested in. I personally don't recommend starting with super big stuff. And the reason for that is it takes a lot longer to sculpt. There are challenges with working with miniatures, sculpting with miniatures, because you are working so tiny, and that seems difficult and more challenging, but they allow you to pull off a lot of tricks that you can't get away with on bigger figures. Plus, with bigger figures, you tend to need more detail, even when you're keeping it simple, because there's so much more surface to cover, and so it can be a little more challenging to find that blend of keeping the figure interesting looking as well. So, but but some people are, obviously, if you want to sculpt big things, if your passion is creatures and giants, then I think it would be a great idea to go ahead and start with that, and start, building up the skill and making something you actually want. But I do usually recommend, I think a 28 millimeter standard kind of figure is a great place to start. It's in between a lot of things. It's small, but big enough to put in good details, so there's practice there. And like I said, you're going to finish it much quicker and easier than you are with a big figure. All right, BE, speaking of tools, that non-sculpting tool, tools. What sculpting tool? What non-sculpting tool do you value most? What do you mean by non-sculpting tool? You mean like that isn't made to be a sculpting tool, but I use it for sculpting? Yes, okay. So I guess, yeah, that's easy. So the non-sculpting tool I value most is my shirt pen, my dress shirt pen. And this is just a shirt pen that I put into a brass rod, filled with a bunch of putty, and I love these. These are very good and useful. I do consider this a sculpting tool, even though it technically isn't. So, but because, I don't know, it's a tool for modeling. I know it's not specifically for sculpting. So if I had to pick a second one or expand on that, I would say my scalpel, just because this is super versatile. And I've talked about this in a lot of videos. You can hit things flat. You've got the curved amount, so you can get around. You can poke a little bit. There's just a lot of ways to do it. And similarly, you can do it with these too. Another thing that's cool about these, I don't use this tool as much. I used to use it all the time. This was gifted to me by the Rodmans, actually. When I first started sculpting, is a needle with a hook in it. So this can be very useful to get up into certain areas where you can't with the straight pin. But you can make those yourself. All it is get the pin and bend it around. This end is another shirt pin, and it's very much this. It's like that, but it's hard to tell. It's just barely curved, and again, it just lets me get in a little bit different than straight in. All right, do another question here. All right, Electric. Hey Tom, hope you're well. I am well. Here's the question. Up until now, I've been using epoxy putty like Green Stuff Milliput for my miniatures, but I'm considering using polymer clay, Sculpey. Yes, that's totally viable to use. Do you think it's a good idea, or should I stick with epoxy ones? I think it's good that you're actually learning the epoxy putties, because even though I prefer to sculpt whole miniatures primarily out of polyclay, there are just some things that it's not going to be able to do for you. Once you bake this figure and you want to go back and add some details, you're going to want to do that with some sort of putty. If you're going to convert a figure, if you're working on a plastic Space Marine and you're going to add something, you're going to want to use putty, because you're going to put it on there. It will self-cure. Because you're not going to be able to bake this stuff without harming your model. So there's just a lot of uses to knowing putty. But with that said, I would, as somebody who personally loves sculpting his miniatures primarily out of polyclay, I would definitely recommend trying it, see what you like. And if you don't like it, you keep doing it in putty. They're both. This was always a funny thing that I always felt a little weird about this, as I just never felt comfortable sculpting in putty. It always just was such a challenge for me. But I would never willing to blame the material or be mad at it, or let that be my excuse, because all around me were these sculptors who were sculpting amazing stuff every day in greater volumes than I ever did out of putty. So it is not a limiting factor by any means. And with all this stuff, it is very important to find materials that you feel comfortable with, that you can get results that you're happy with, and that you'll enjoy, because you're going to be doing this for many hours on each figure. So you better be having a good time. And that is why I don't typically do full putty, because I don't have a good time usually. I'm usually quite stressed out. But I have learned ways to cope with it and do better. One of the things for me with putty, a lot of people will, a lot of sculptors, some of the more successful ones I've seen that do putty, they'll do a lot of putty at once. So they'll do a bunch of putty all over the legs, and they'll be doing the whole legs and maybe even more of the figure, and they'll just keep going. That stressed me out so much, and I just was moving so slow that I couldn't get what I needed. So I developed what might be actually a bad habit, because it made me even slower, of just doing small parts. So I would do just this part of the leg, or just this leg, or just a foot. And I would do it, and I would let it go, and then maybe I'd move to the other side, but it was much slower. But that's how I was able to, that's how I needed to work in order to get the results. All right. I'll do another question here in a second. This will be fun to actually have this figure made someday. I say that because even though I'm working on it now, there's no promises that I'll get back to it anytime soon. Maybe it will be my stream miniature until I get it finished. All right. The extra care comes through in the quality minis. Thank you for that. Yeah, I appreciate that. Do I find it easier to sculpt organic or inorganic forms? I definitely find it easier to sculpt organic forms, although it's maybe not, how do I say this? It's probably not as hard. I guess it depends on what you're doing with it. So the inorganic forms that I have sculpted for the most have been the Mercs line. And if you notice with those designs, now Keith designed them, but one of the reasons I started working with Keith Lowe, was because I loved his design sense. It was mechanical, there was armor and tech, but it wasn't all super hard edge and completely encased sort of stuff. There was still clothing and interesting shapes. So that's how I've tended, and if you look at my own Havoc Protocol stuff, those the boots they wear and stuff, there's an elegant organic movement to it, even though there are some more technical parts to them. So that's how I've dealt with that, to be able to enjoy it, and also be able to execute it. But someone like Jeff Wilhelm, who does some amazing hard edge modeled stuff, I used to just drool over the models I would see, or he would post. He did a lot of the MechWarrior Dark Age, and I think he did a lot of other things, but that's just what I specifically saw. And it was all made out of plastic card, and it was filed and little bits cut, and that just blows me away when I see that stuff. And it is also totally not for me. All right. Anthony says, in your opinion, what is your recommendation for putty mix for sculpting faces? All right, that's actually a really good question, because I don't know if it's still gets floated around there very much, but I remember when I was coming up, always hearing about use this mix for this application, use that mix for that application. And, so for instance, some people Bobby Jackson, I think it was, would use brown stuff for faces because it had a different consistency than the green stuff. And I tried that. I tried a lot of different things. In the end, for me, I sculpt everything to the same consistency. It varies some just because I might not grab the same amount of putty every time, but I prefer my material to be a little softer and a little easier to manipulate. So I do about a 2-to-1 blue-green, maybe a little less. Sorry, I said that wrong. 2-to-1 yellow-blue. So more yellow, less blue, and I do sometimes have a little less yellow, but it's a nice sticky consistency. It's a brighter green, and for pretty much everything I'm sculpting, I find that to be a nicer a blend. Now I've got other friends who love more resistance in the material. I don't know if it's because they have a heavier touch or if they just want to be able to get certain hard knocks in and not have everything squish around as much. And so, yeah, you might find that you don't care for my mix, but this is what I typically do for everything. I'm doing this straight green stuff, but when I'm actually sculpting details, every now and then I will use straight green stuff, but most of the time, especially if it's a larger area, I will actually mix this also with Aves Epoxy Sculpt. It's still definitely a putty when you do that, but it does react a little bit more like clay. You'll see, you can see that stretch and have some tearing a little bit, but for the most part, it's just like a paste that's stretching. When you mix it with the Aves, it breaks a lot more like clay does, and so you can also pat it on there, and as long as you don't have too much Vaseline or lubricant, you can blend it in really easily. So that's why I do that. All right, let's get a little bit of material on these legs. Usually I keep my putty here, but I've had the clay there, so there's some dust, so it's not sticking as well. So I will move that off to a different nail. All right, I'll do another question. Oh, another one from Electric. I like that name, that's cool. Do you wait for the green stuff to cure before applying the layer of Fimo? No, absolutely not. You do not wait for that first layer of green stuff to cure. You get it on there, you do as much as you can, and then you start putting the Fimo on there, as you've been seeing in this video. That's why I was pointing out that you might have to do smaller areas, especially if you're slow when you're starting out, because you want this to be a stickier amount. You want the green stuff to be sticky. If it starts to cure, even when it's not fully hardened, but as it starts to cure, it's harder for the Fimo to grab onto. All right, Anthony, just green stuff 1-to-1 or green stuff with epoxy 1-to-1? Can't seem to catch much detail for me. All right, so let me clarify. So when I'm doing green stuff, I do want to say this, Knead-A-Tight. It was designed to have more yellow in the mix than blue. When you buy it in the tapes, you might notice that it's not 50-50. You'll see the yellow part of the tape is thicker than the blue part. So they intend for you to have like 125%, 150%, I don't remember what the actual ratio is, of yellow compared to the blue. And that's how I prefer to sculpt. That's how I was first introduced to it. And as I played with having more blue, I find that when you have more blue, it does give more resistance, but it tends to be even more gummy, and it tends to be a little harder to get hard edges. Now, with that said, if you mix the green stuff, if you mix green stuff with Aves, I've actually found that 1-to-1 to then the two parts of Aves Epoxy Sculpt, A and B, 1-to-1. So 1-to-1 to 1-to-1 actually is a pretty good mix. It's okay if you have a little more yellow, but it's not as necessary because whatever I'm getting out of extra yellow in the green stuff is given to me by whatever the Aves is doing. So for that one, you can, I at least, pretty much use equal parts of it all. Actually, a lot of times I use even less Aves now I think about it. I should do another video or discuss that more, but I know a lot of people who use the Aves and green stuff mix do it all straight 1-to-1 to 1-to-1, but I tend to do, it's probably, yeah, 2-to-1. So I'll mix this up, whatever this is, and then maybe have 50% of that amount as Aves. That's usually what I do, but you might prefer having a little more Aves in there because it will, I find it's a little easier to get some sharp details. Now a trick with putty, with all putty sculpting, and this is another bad habit I have because I hate to wait. I like my material to be consistent and I like it to respond the same throughout the sculpt. So that's another challenge with putty is it's always changing. You want to get things on it first as quickly as possible and then so it's easy to stick and it's easy to spread. And you can do some detail, but back to the sunk fallacy discussion we were having earlier, part of me overworking and working the green stuff is because I never had the patience to wait the 10, 15 minutes to let it set up before I would do certain things. So I kind of got used to just working it until it finally got to where I was, or working it as fast as possible so that I would be working in a consistent soft state. But that does make it harder to get some of those nice sharp cuts. Those usually are easier to do as the putty sets up. But it's a challenge because you have to do it at the right time. You have to get enough of everything set up in the right bulked out position before you put in those final details. Because if you don't have the large form worked out, then you're not going to be able to manipulate the putty enough. I think I caught the question. I saw one other thing pop up, but I can't remember if that was something else. So if I missed it, then ask again and I'll catch it. All right, we'll do this question from Snagger. Beautiful work, Tom. What clay do you use or recommend to sculpt with for a beginner? I recommend for clay, oh, here we go. I'm gonna do Josh's dumb question real quick and then I'll go back to this one. Does green stuff expire? I've been using the same hoard of it for like 3 years. It's harder, but still seems to work, at least for what I need. I don't know if it formally has an expiration date, but it can go bad, I guess. That's actually another reason that I don't use Procreate as much. It definitely seemed to expire a lot easier. Green stuff holds up for quite some time. Now, I will say this, if you do have putty, green stuff Procreate, any unused amount, put it in a Ziploc bag and throw it in your freezer. That helps maintain it, and then when you're ready to use it, you just pull it out. You don't have to wait this long, but ideally let it thaw for 24 hours, get your batch out. But this right here, this batch, this actually is a newer batch, but I've had some of the same green stuff from Procreate for 10 years. I've worked through it now, but there was a time that I had a batch that was that old. This stuff has been in these containers probably for close to a year, and it is still great and supple. And I just keep it in these little bead containers just to have them easily stacked together, the 3 things I need, the 2 parts and then some Vaseline. And it seems to keep enough air out and holds up nice. I feel like the tape tends to go bad worse. This was from the tube, so it keeps the green and the blue. So I don't know if there's something, obviously with the tape, the center where they touch is already cured by the time you will have gotten it. But I do wonder sometimes if, because of the contact, it helps encourage the skin to form. Usually what you'll find is you'll end up encountering like a skin that'll form around the yellow part especially. And that is very bad stuff. And you can mix up your putty, but then you'll keep finding all these flakes in it. So I find it better, even though it's a bit wasteful, it's usually better to scrape that stuff off and pitch it, because you will be, talk about fighting a losing battle. You will definitely be fighting a losing battle with that putty. It is not worth it. Okay, back to this question. What do I recommend? Typically I'm using Fimo Professional, and I do recommend that because it's so readily available. You've got different colors that you can play with if you don't want to, use a white, gray, or something like that. And it's just it's a really good polyclay. I prefer it over Super Sculpey, although that does work, and I have done some sculpting with that. I always feel like I've used Sculpey a lot more for large figures, but whenever I've used it, I always feel like there's this massive residue. And with this stuff, you can feel a little bit on your fingers with the Fimo, but it's a lot less. And I don't know, I don't tend to have any allergic reactions, but with Sculpey, I could feel like my hands were, I don't know, getting itchy or something a little more. So there must be something in that that's different. So that's what I'd recommend. All right, how do you motivate yourself on days you don't want to art, or do you not face that challenge? Thanks, Jake. I 100% face that challenge. And we all do, everybody does. My heroes do, but it sure looks like nobody else faces it. That's how I feel. I always feel like nobody else is facing it when I'm facing it. So I don't know that it actually helps to know that, but I just felt like it was good to say that. With that said, how do I art? Well, like I touched on this a little bit earlier. It was always such a struggle for me. I would get in my own way, and I would psych myself out, and I would keep putting things off. So there's several different things. One, I found that I can't have too many things on my plate at once, or I get overwhelmed and I just want to sit around and look around on social media or watch shows or videos or something. I won't even play a game because that's too much engagement, I guess, which is sad because I would much rather, be conquering Zelda game rather than, scrolling Facebook. But so one of the things that I had to really start to invest in is get excited about going in and doing this work. And I don't know how, I'll have to think about a better way to articulate that. But I started to look at it as my fun time, and I treated it like my fun time. Oh, had a hard day at work. Oh, go sculpt for a little bit. And it doesn't always work. But one thing that I do is I know I said don't have too many things on my plate, but I try to have different aspects of what I need to do to work on. So, I needed to paint some miniatures for the Goblin Menace, so that was one thing. If I'm sculpting a figure, I like to have one that I'm kind of starting and one that I'm trying to finish. Even though I tend to focus on one figure, it's good to make armatures or bulk up forms, because that way when you're not filling up to maybe the harder work of sculpting, you can at least be doing something and getting something productive done. And sometimes, doing this simple stuff that seems pretty mindless can get you over that hump. So you're like, oh, it's not so bad. I do like sitting at my desk and pushing putty around. How long do you spend on a fig like a goblin? Do you work on a group altogether? That's from Perkins. So I have not specifically timed myself on a goblin since I did the first batch of 5. And when I did those, they were taking me 4 hours tops. They're obviously smaller figures. I did some time studies on miniatures back in the day, And I felt like I was getting between, when I was really hitting a stride, I was doing about 10 hours for a figure, probably, maybe a little more. But like I said, I was kind of flitting around to all these different aspects. So it felt like way longer than that to me, but I don't think it usually was. As far as working on them all together and stuff, with the Goblin Menace, I did the first 5, and then I ended up doing 2 that were a little bit more independent, even though they were for the whole group. And then I was just decided to bang them all out. And those ones I worked, all together. I actually did what I was talking about here is I roughed in as many as possible. So, and then when I maybe got 5 done, or maybe even 10, I would go in to start to work on some, and then every now and then I would take one to completion, but sometimes I would jump over to another one just to keep the needle moving. In the end, though, I do prefer, I suggested working on and getting other ones going so that you're not starting from the very beginning by the time you get done with them. So if you finish a full sculpt and then you move on, you're like, okay, it's time to sculpt a brand new sculpt, and there's nothing, not even an armature. It just feels like there's so much more to do to get going. So I like to have a little bit of it underway, because then it just feels like less of a hill to climb. I think I derailed myself. I was going to say something else, but I forgot what it was now. Your goblins have a nice mix and consistency at the same time. Thank you. Yes. Oh, that's what I was talking about. So yeah, those I posed up. And that was another reason that I did that with the goblins. There was a lot to do. I ended up doing 20. But the other reason, because there were so many, I wanted to make sure that there was enough variety. And so that's why I decided to tackle, well, first I actually did a sketch of a bunch of different poses to help work that out. But then I actually did the work of sculpting them to make sure, once again, make sure that the poses would be a little distinct from one another, and to keep that variety. And then again, as I started working extra details, I would try not to have too much repeat, although, you can take that way too far and have everything look like a totally unique snowflake, and that just adds a lot of time, especially on little things like that. It's not always necessary. All right. I've only got 3 questions left, so we're doing great. I got 3 questions left from my original Ask for Questions, and I'm loving all the things you guys are asking. So we'll move through these, and then, probably going about another 15 minutes. We'll see. I have no idea how my phone's battery's doing. All right, this is from Fernando. Fernando lives in a country where there is no sculpting resources. He made his own tools, and he uses a 10-minute epoxy. Whew, that's a fast epoxy. For repairing things, not sculpting, but for the things I have done in the past. Okay, so on his big monsters. He's very happy with the results. He tried making a 32mm miniature with it and failed horribly. Do you think it would be possible to sculpt with something like that? And if so, how would you approach it? Well, yeah, I think this piggybacks on a lot of the other things that I've said. I definitely think you can sculpt with it. I don't think I would want to sculpt with it. But if you have no choice, then I think it's certainly worth giving it a go. What I can say about how you would approach it, you might actually find a lot of success in how I was talking about sculpting, which is, instead of trying to do a lot at once, work on a section. So work on that part of the leg, work on the foot. Now, the tricky thing with that, and that's what I had to learn, even though I had more time to sculpt with my putty than you do, is it is a challenge. It takes some time to get used to seeing this element, seeing everything basically look like a thin skeleton, except for this element, which is the correct size, the full size, and it has detail. And then you move up, and it can play with your mind, because you're like, oh, I think I've got the armature and proportions right, but then things aren't, wide enough or whatnot. So, if you're going to go down that road, I highly suggest that you keep a good reference miniature around. Something that is in the right scale and style and proportion that you are trying to do yourself, and get your ruler out and measure a lot. Check what you're doing against what they're doing. That is a great way to get past the issue of, you know, making giant feet or a giant head because you overcompensated, or a pinhead, you know, or tiny little feet when you need them to be bigger. All right, Goblin of Gaxon, Guy Gaxonor. I haven't seen you in a long time. Thanks for coming. Have I 3D scanned any practical models with any success? I personally have not had any. I have not personally 3D scanned any of my miniatures, and I don't believe that any of my miniatures have been 3D scanned for, you know, companies I did work with. I am under the understanding that there are some companies out there that have the ability and are having some success with it. So I have no idea what their machine is, but it can be done. I'm not sure how much cleanup is involved with it, though, or I think typically it's not, you know, a magic scan. Planet Tobor shared this with me, and I need to check this out more, but there's basically this 3D printable kit that you can print this rig and attach your phone to it, and there's a little app on there that will basically 3D scan a miniature, and it's looks pretty easy to use and very reasonable. So I've been thinking about messing around with that. Could be a lot of fun. There it is, Open Scan Mini. Yes, that sounds right. So check that out. I mean, it's definitely not some super, you know, it's meant to be, what are we called? Individual users, you know. It's an at-home thing, but I mean, those technologies are getting more and more usable by the day. All right, I got another one from Zeno Serum. He says, Blueberry Bandits for the win. My question would be, how would you sculpt lightning without making it too chunky? Oh, I tried Mushroom, but it wasn't working for you. DIY, oh gosh, yes, DIY Pro. So I'm repairing a wall, so my desk is kind of in the way of where I need to scoot over to read the chat. All right. Yeah, okay. Do you recommend tape or bars? I prefer the bar. I'm going to look at the chat here for a second. I prefer the bars when I am sculpting for my green stuff. I like to buy those because it's already separated. You will inevitably end up with more blue if you sculpt like I do, but it doesn't matter. It's very cheap, and if you really want to use the blue, whenever I would have something larger and just need to build up form, I would always put more blue in my mix because I really only care about having more yellow when I'm trying to get detail, and it just keeps much better with that. All right, I think I've caught everybody's. Mushroom wasn't working. I reset it. Yep, and then DIY. Okay, back to the sculpting and to the question. So yeah, the four groups for the goblins in the demo are the Blueberry Bandits. That's winning the vote. So Blueberry Bandits, the Carrot Clan, the Lettuce Lunks, and the Grape Gang. So the question is, my question would be, how would you sculpt lightning without making it look chunky? I have done that, and I totally forgot. I was going to get a picture of the miniature that I did. It is actually, it's unfortunate, it's one of the sculpts that I've done that I never got returned to me, that was supposed to be returned to me, and I don't think it was ever produced either. So it's a big bummer. It was done for Eastern Front Studios. It was this wizard that had his hand held out to the side, and had this cool, you could put a little ball of flame in the hand, or you could do a lightning bit. And the way I did that was I got some copper wire or some sort of wire, and I bent it into shape. I believe I would have crimped it in a couple spots too, just to make the wire a little flatter. Whenever I have long bits of wire that needed putty on them, I tend to crimp it so that it's a little bit more of a square or flat shape. It just helps the putty stay on better, otherwise it wants to twist around a bunch. And for that, I definitely did a mix of green stuff and Aves so that it could be, that's the other big bonus with mixing your putty with Aves, is it can be filed. It cures rock hard, so you can file and cut it a lot easier. And so I started by, just getting a thin tube of green stuff over the whole thing. And then I would add a little bit more here and there, and just trying to make it look like it had some fun angles and shapes along it. And then after it was all cured up and looked, I tried to get it as smooth as possible, but inevitably it looked pretty rough. I would go over it again with a file and just start to file that down into a nice shape. And I specifically tried to have it be a little thinner front to back and have a little more shape side to side, so it could have kind of a look of thick to thin lines. I tried not to have it turning and twisting with the thick to thick, because then if you were looking at it, I guess that could look pretty cool, because if you change the angle you would get a variation, but the one time I did it, that's not how I did it. All right. I need to get this figure into a patented, somebody used to call this a mason jar, a Tom Mason jar. I think that might have been Patrick Keith that called that to me, or it might have been somebody else. I don't remember. But yeah, I typically, I got one right here. Typically keep any clay figure I'm working on in a jar. Put some sticky tack here, press that down, and it's a glass jar, so I guess if I did drop it, it would shatter everywhere. But biggest reasons for this is, if I'm bumping it around while it's unbaked, it protects the figure. Another big thing, it just keeps the dust off, which isn't the end of the world, but when you're looking at these things as close as we are sculpting, it can be annoying to see a errant piece of dust sticking off an eyeball or something. Especially every now and then you get something that's a little bigger, and it can actually mess with your sculpting. You'll go to smooth out this detail, and this little tiny hair or piece of dust will press in and make a little gouge. All right, this is my last question, and then I will see if there's anything left on the chat. The Undead Sculptor. Ooh. Hi Tom, I've been watching your channel for 8 years, since the Myth Boss Alley. That was a fun figure. Speaking of big figures, it took me a long time to do that one. And I'm currently on my own freelance mini sculpting journey. You've been a constant source of inspiration for me, and I've always loved your channel. What would you say your character concept workflow looks like? How long do you spend in the idea phase, and so on? All right, my character concept workflow, I definitely spend a lot of time in the concept phase. It depends on what I'm working on. It can go for a long time. When I was doing the goblins, this would be a great retrospective to do, because it actually spans quite a few sketchbooks where I would work on the concept here, let it sit for 6 months or a year, work on it again, until I finally got to what I'm at right now with the goblins. And I've had several other, especially Havoc Protocol was the same way. I did a bunch of different things. I really like to work out my characters on paper first. If nothing else, even if I know what they're going to be, I like to get a rough pose drawn rather than try and figure that out in the sculpture itself. It just saves me a lot of time, especially when you're working traditionally. It can be a little more forgiving digitally because you can tweak it as much as possible, but if you've made a really good armature and you're not sure how you want the figure to go and you just keep bending the arms over and over again, you're going to break it eventually. So I like to have that figured out a little bit first. All right, Fernando, thanks. I'm now where you respond to my question. I will try to sculpt that way. Maybe better, actually, for me to just a hobby, and generally I don't have much time. Yeah, I mean, we all have to look at what we want out of sculpting. I love miniatures. I love playing the miniature games and painting them. I love, this probably makes sense, one of my favorite things to do with miniatures is just to build the kits, because it's like easy sculpting in a way. But we all have to ask why we're doing this. I was always dreamt of being a professional artist for my career. That was originally comic books, and as I fell into, showed an affinity and a desire for sculpting and just my love of miniatures, it turned to that. And so that's just always been a part of why I've done this. I've wanted to create things and put it out, not just for my own enjoyment, but to share with everybody else. So that's definitely something you have to ask. And there's nothing wrong with doing it just for yourself and just building your skill and enjoying that. I mean, I actually have to wrestle with this myself, because even though I do make an income from this and I have a following, I have a day job. This is not my full-time job. I'm making the videos, making the miniatures. It's something I do on the side as well. And I had to, how long ago was it? Probably 4 or 5 years ago, it really hit me, and I had to really come to peace with that, and being okay with the fact that I don't have as much time to dedicate to this as I might want to, or as my peers do, and find ways to still make great work and do what I could do. All right. Yes, thank you. Thanks, Goblin. All right, I'm gonna let's do another few questions here, and then yeah, we'll go to 9:30ish. All right, Jude. Yes, I would love to see you at Adepticon. I just put out a post on my newsletter. If anybody is signed up to that, that's where I will make sure and let people know when things are going on. But obviously, I mentioned here on the videos too. But yeah, we'll be demoing the Goblin Menace and hanging out, playing games. I'll be there with Planet Tobor as well with his game. So come by and say hi and check it out. We'll talk about sculpting. You can check out the game if you want, but it'll be great to see everybody. All right, Jake says, so did you ever study the old masters like Bernini and Donatello and whatnot? So I did technically study them. I had classes on them. I'm aware of a lot of their work. My favorite sculptor was always Rodin, but I was not a good student with that. You know, I was always very focused on what I wanted to do. I wanted to draw comics. I wanted to paint miniatures. I wanted to sculpt miniatures. And so while I was aware of them and I was inspired by them, I never took the time to do master studies and like try and emulate their skills. And I wish I had. I missed out a lot by not doing those things, but you can't go back, and I'm happy with what I'm doing now. It just felt like it was a struggle to get there. And I think some of that was because I always thought it had to come straight out of me. Had that arrogant, I don't even want to call it arrogant, it's maybe more foolish. This foolish idea that to be a true artist, it has to all come out of you, and forgetting this idea that you don't know anything. You have to learn first. Jake got into art because he wanted to do pencils on Wolverine. Yes, never went anywhere with it though. Yeah, Jim Lee, X-Men, #1, Image. I was so enamored with all of that and just the superheroes of every kind. But yeah, that was always my dream. I was gonna be a Marvel artist, but that did not go anywhere fast either. So, does anybody have any other questions for me before we head out for the night? All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining me. I really appreciate all the questions that you had, and I'm glad I got through everybody's comments. I think going forward, I'm going to do it this way rather than collecting questions from the comments. We'll just see what I might take a couple from some places, but I like the idea of just being able to talk with everybody and get a little sculpting done. And yeah, hopefully you got some enjoyment out of this, and maybe if you didn't this time, you can be sculpting with me as well. Alrighty, well, until next time, everybody, keep sculpting.